I was standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel, clutching a small silver gift box, when I realized something was terribly wrong. The ballroom doors were wide open behind the reception desk. I could see crystal chandeliers glowing softly, white roses cascading from tall centerpieces, and hundreds of guests dressed in designer suits and gowns, laughing and raising their glasses. My sister's wedding was already in full swing. But when I gave my name, the young woman behind the desk stopped smiling. She scrolled through the guest list once, then again. Then she looked up at me with an expression that wasn't confusion anymore, it was pity. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said quietly. "Your name isn't on the list." For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake. I was the bride's sister. I had flown across the country for this day. I was holding a wedding gift in my hands. Surely someone had forgotten to add my name. But deep down, I already knew the truth. My parents had banned me from my sister's wedding. Not because of a fight. Not because we were estranged. Not because I had done anything wrong. I wasn't there because my sister didn't want me there, and my parents had chosen her side. I stepped away from the desk and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and impatient, music and laughter echoing behind her. "You really thought you'd be invited?" she scoffed. "This wedding is for people who matter." Those words hit harder than I expected. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just looked down at the small silver box in my hands, the one thing I had brought with me. She had no idea what was inside. So instead of causing a scene, I did something no one saw coming. I walked to the gift table, placed my present among the extravagant boxes and envelopes, and quietly left the hotel. I didn't stay to watch her walk down the aisle. I didn't stay for the speeches or the champagne. I didn't stay for the celebration I had been deliberately excluded from. Hours later, my sister opened my gift in front of everyone. And that was the moment everything she believed about her life, her family, and herself began to collapse. My phone hasn't stopped ringing since. But before I tell you what was inside that box and why it made my sister scream in front of hundreds of guests, you need to understand how we got here. Because this story isn't really about a wedding. It's about a lifetime of being invisible. And the one moment I finally refused to be. Stay with me. My name is Myra Wells. I'm a photographer. I run a studio in Los Angeles, the kind of job that sounds simple when you say it out loud, but took years of quiet work, sleepless nights, and stubborn belief to build. I tell you this not to impress you, but because for a long time, the people who were supposed to know me best never bothered to ask what I did or who I had become. Today, I want to tell you a story. Not the kind you skim through while half listening, but the kind that sits with you afterward. The kind that makes you think about your own family, your own silences, the moments when you realized you didn't belong where you thought you did. This story begins on the day my parents banned me from my sister's wedding. But to understand why that moment mattered, and why a small silver gift box made my sister scream in front of 400 people, you need to come with me to the very beginning. I was standing in the lobby of a five-star hotel in Boston, holding a small silver box tied with a white ribbon, when something in my chest tightened. The ballroom doors were wide open behind the reception desk. I could see everything. Crystal chandeliers glowing like constellations, towering white floral arrangements, men in tailored suits, women in designer dresses, champagne glasses clinking in effortless celebration. A string quartet played softly somewhere inside, their music floating into the marble-floored lobby. It was my sister Victoria's wedding. 400 guests had been invited, and somehow, I wasn't one of them. When I gave my name to the young woman behind the desk, she smiled politely and looked down at the guest list. Her finger moved slowly down the page. Then she flipped to the next page. Then another. Her smile faded, replaced by a look that wasn't confusion anymore. It was pity. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said gently. "Your name isn't on the list." For a brief moment, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. I was the bride's sister. I had flown across the country. I was holding a wedding gift. Surely this was a mistake. "Could you check again?" I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. She did. Twice more. Then she looked up and shook her head. That was when the truth settled in. This wasn't an oversight. This was intentional. I stepped away from the desk, my heels echoing softly against the marble floor, and pulled out my phone. I already knew who I needed to call. Victoria answered on the second ring. "What?" she snapped. Behind her, I could hear laughter, glasses clinking, the low hum of celebration. "I'm at the hotel," I said. "They say my name isn't on the guest list." There was a pause, just long enough to confirm everything I'd been afraid of. "I know," she said flatly. "You know," I repeated. "You really thought you'd be invited?" She laughed, sharp and cold. "This wedding is for people who matter, Myra. Important people, not someone who takes pictures for a living." I closed my eyes. "I just wanted to give you a gift," I said quietly. "A gift?" she scoffed. "What could you possibly give me that I don't already have?" Then she lowered her voice. "Do not cause a scene. Just leave." And she hung up. I stood there for a long moment, staring at my phone. Around me, strangers moved in and out of the lobby, smiling, hugging, congratulating one another. No one paid attention to the woman standing alone with a gift she wasn't allowed to give. I didn't cry. I didn't argue with the staff. I didn't demand to speak to anyone. I had spent my entire life learning how to leave quietly. Instead, I walked toward the gift table. It was massive, overflowing with beautifully wrapped boxes, envelopes thick with checks, designer logos everywhere you looked. My silver box looked almost modest by comparison, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. I placed it near the edge, tucked the card beneath the ribbon, and stepped back. On the card, I had written only this: "To Victoria. From your sister, Myra." Then I turned around and walked out of the hotel. I didn't stay to watch my sister walk down the aisle. I didn't stay for the vows, the speeches, the first dance. I didn't stay for a celebration I had been deliberately erased from. As soon as I stepped outside, the autumn air hit my face, cool and sharp. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and booked the next flight back to Los Angeles. I told myself I was fine. I told myself this didn't hurt. But here's the part no one tells you about being excluded by your own family. It doesn't break you all at once. It wears you down slowly, over years, until moments like this feel almost expected. What my sister didn't know, what no one inside that ballroom knew, was what was inside that small silver box. She didn't know that hours later, she would open it in front of hundreds of guests. She didn't know that the truth inside would unravel everything she believed about herself, her family, and her place in the world. And she definitely didn't know that my parents, who had chosen to ban me from their perfect daughter's perfect day, would soon be calling me over and over again, desperate, angry, terrified. Before I tell you what happened when she opened that gift, you need to understand something. This story didn't begin in that hotel lobby. It began years earlier, in a family that looked perfect from the outside and quietly broke one daughter on the inside. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever been told, without words, that you mattered less, stay with me, because what happened next wasn't revenge. It was something far more powerful. I grew up in a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine, a 3-story colonial, on a quiet, historic street in Boston. White columns, tall windows, perfectly trimmed hedges. From the outside, we were the kind of family people admired, without knowing anything about us. Wealthy, respected, the kind that donated to the right charities, attended the right galas, and vacationed in places that sounded impressive when mentioned casually at dinner parties. To the world, we were perfect. Inside those walls, though, there were only 2 daughters, and only one of us truly mattered. My sister Victoria was 3 years older than me. From as early as I can remember, she seemed to take up more space than I ever could. She had the bigger bedroom with the bay windows. She had new clothes every season, piano lessons, dance recitals, and birthday parties that felt more like social events than celebrations for a child. I had hand-me-downs, quiet praise when it was convenient, and long stretches of being unnoticed. No one ever sat me down and said, "We love her more." They didn't need to. Favoritism doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's in the way conversations stop when you enter the room, or how your accomplishments are acknowledged with a nod while someone else's are celebrated with champagne. Victoria was described as driven, ambitious, special. I was easy, low maintenance, independent, is another. Those words sound harmless, even flattering, but what they really meant was this: Victoria demanded attention, and I learned not to. My parents responded to volume. Victoria was loud about what she wanted, loud about what upset her, loud about what she deserved. I was quiet. I learned early that being quiet made life smoother. Fewer arguments, fewer disappointed looks, fewer reminders that my needs came second. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed good enough, patient enough, invisible enough, things would eventually balance out. They didn't. The first time I truly understood my place in the family, I was 10 years old. I remember that birthday clearly, not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. Turning 10 felt important to me. Double digits. A milestone. I counted down the days, imagining a cake with my name written in frosting, balloons, maybe even a small party like the one Victoria had when she turned 10, complete with a rented pony, and a catered lunch that people still talked about years later. That morning, I woke up early, too excited to sleep. I got dressed and ran downstairs. The kitchen was empty. My mother was in the living room, on the phone, discussing details of Victoria's upcoming cotillion, seating arrangements, dress fittings, guest lists. My father had already left for work. "Mom," I said, standing there in my socks. "It's my birthday." She covered the phone receiver and smiled distractedly. "I know, sweetheart. We'll do something later." Later never came. There was no cake, no dinner, no acknowledgement beyond that brief moment. By the time evening arrived, I had already learned my lesson. Hoping only made the disappointment sharper. That night, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was my grandmother, Eleanor, my father's mother. She sat beside me on the bed and handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a real camera, not a toy, solid, slightly heavy, with a leather strap that felt important in my hands. "You see things differently," she said, brushing my hair back gently. "One day, that will matter." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I just knew that someone had noticed me, truly noticed me. That feeling stayed with me long after she left the room. Growing up, moments like that were rare. At school, I did well. I wasn't the loudest or the most popular, but I worked hard. I found comfort in observing rather than participating, in capturing moments rather than performing in them. Photography became my refuge. Through a lens, I could make sense of the world. I could frame what mattered. At home, my achievements were met with polite approval. A good grade earned a "that's nice." Victoria's achievements earned celebrations. When she won an award, we went out to dinner. When she struggled, the household revolved around her emotions. When I struggled, I learned to deal with it quietly. By the time I reached my teenage years, the roles were firmly set. Victoria was the center of gravity. My parents orbited her needs, her plans, her future. I existed on the periphery, careful not to disrupt the balance. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I didn't need much. That belief carried me all the way to the day I graduated high school. I had earned a full scholarship to a prestigious art school, something I had worked toward for years. I was even selected to give a short speech at graduation. I practiced for weeks, imagining my parents sitting in the audience, proud, finally seeing me. On the morning of the ceremony, I came downstairs in my cap and gown. My parents were at the kitchen table. Victoria was there too, scrolling through her phone. "The ceremony starts at 2, I said. "We should probably leave by 1. My mother didn't look up. Something came up. My father glanced at me briefly. "Victoria has a networking event. It's important for her career." That was it. No discussion, no hesitation. I stood there in my graduation gown, holding my speech notes, and realized something fundamental had never changed. Even on the most important day of my life, I was optional. I walked to that ceremony alone. When my name was called and I stepped onto the stage, I scanned the audience. I saw one familiar face, my grandmother, sitting in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else. Afterward, she hugged me and whispered, "Some things are passed down quietly. Don't forget that." At the time, I didn't know how deeply those words would shape my future. What I did know was this: I could no longer stay in a place where I was constantly shrinking myself to make others comfortable. And so, not long after that day, I made a decision that would change everything. I packed my bags. I bought a one-way ticket. And I left a family that had never truly seen me. What happened next is where my real life began. I left Boston on a gray morning that felt heavier than it should have. 2 suitcases, one backpack, no farewell breakfast, no hugs at the door. My parents were already gone when I woke up. Victoria didn't bother to come out of her room. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet of a house that had never really felt like home, then closed the door behind me. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't leave a note. There was no dramatic exit, no final argument, no slammed doors. I had learned long ago that silence was the language my family understood best, so I left the same way I had lived there, quietly, carefully, without expecting anyone to notice. On the plane to Los Angeles, I stared out the window as the city I grew up in shrank beneath the clouds. I told myself I wasn't running away. I was choosing something else, choosing space, choosing possibility, choosing a life where I wouldn't have to compete for permission to exist. I was 18 years old, terrified, and strangely relieved. Los Angeles was overwhelming at first, louder, brighter, faster than anything I'd known. People talked about dreams the way my family talked about, investments casually, seriously, like they mattered. I rented a tiny room in a shared apartment with 3 other girls who were all chasing something different: acting, fashion, music. No one asked about my parents' connections or my last name. No one cared where I came from. For the first time, I was just Myra. I enrolled in art school, throwing myself into photography with a focus that bordered on obsession. I worked part-time jobs to cover what my scholarship didn't: coffee shops, retail, anything that paid hourly and didn't ask too many questions. At night, I edited photos until my eyes burned. I learned how to tell stories through images, how to capture emotion without asking for it. Photography wasn't just a skill to me. It was proof that I could create something meaningful without anyone's approval. During my second year, I answered an ad looking for an assistant to a wedding photographer. The pay was terrible. The hours were worse. But I said yes without hesitation. That job taught me everything school didn't. I carried heavy equipment. I adjusted lighting while guests ignored me. I watched how moments unfolded when people thought no one important was looking. Weddings, I learned, were full of truth. Joy, insecurity, tension, performance, sometimes all in the same room. I loved it. I learned how to anticipate moments before they happened, how to disappear into the background while still capturing everything. It felt familiar, in a way I didn't immediately recognize. I had been practicing invisibility my whole life. Now, it was finally useful. After graduation, I stayed in Los Angeles. My parents didn't object. They didn't encourage me either. They simply accepted it as another quiet decision I had made without involving them. Victoria called occasionally, always to update me on her life. Promotions, new apartments, impressive dinners. She never asked how I was doing. "Still taking pictures?" she asked once, her tone amused. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "Well, good luck with that." I hung up and went back to editing a wedding shoot that would later win a regional award. Years passed like that. Slowly, deliberately. I saved every dollar I could. I took on small clients, then bigger ones. I built a portfolio piece by piece. When I finally started my own studio, I chose the name carefully. Everlight. Something steady, something enduring, something that didn't need to shout. I never told my family. Not because I wanted to hide my success, but because I didn't want it measured against anyone else's expectations. I didn't want my worth reduced to a comparison with Victoria's career or my parents' approval. This life was mine. Quietly, stubbornly mine. By my late 20s, Everlight Studios had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. A small team, a waiting list, clients who trusted me with their most important moments. We were booked months in advance. Then, a year. Then, two. I bought my own apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Morning light that filled the space without asking permission. Sometimes I stood there with a cup of coffee and thought about the girl who had left Boston with 2 suitcases and no one to say goodbye. I was proud of her. Still, there were moments, small, unguarded ones, when the absence of my family pressed against me. Holidays I spent working, birthdays marked by quiet dinners with friends, achievements celebrated by colleagues instead of parents. I told myself I didn't care. Then my grandmother died. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing contracts. A Boston number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When the attorney told me she was gone, the world seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. She had been the one constant thread of warmth in a family that otherwise felt conditional. The only person who had seen me without asking me to prove anything. I flew back to Boston that same day. The funeral was held at a historic church, filled with people whose lives she had touched. Patrons of the arts, former students, people who spoke about her generosity, her eye for beauty, her belief in nurturing talent. I sat alone. My parents were in the front row, accepting condolences. Victoria stood beside them, composed and elegant in black. I noticed how often they whispered to each other, how their glances darted between the attorney and the casket. They weren't grieving, they were calculating. I heard snippets of conversation as people passed by: jewelry, estates, collections, timelines. I stared straight ahead, my hands clenched in my lap, feeling something harden inside my chest. This wasn't new. This was just the first time I couldn't ignore it. After the service, the attorney asked me to stay behind. "There's something your grandmother wanted you to have," he said quietly. In a small office at the back of the church, he handed me an envelope. Inside were documents I read 3 times before they made sense. My grandmother had made arrangements, specific ones she wanted kept private until the right moment. As I held those papers, I understood something with painful clarity. She had known exactly who my family was. She had known exactly who I was. And she had planned accordingly. I walked out of that church carrying more than grief. I was carrying a truth that would change everything. At the time, I had no idea how or when it would surface. I only knew this: the life I had built in silence was about to collide with the family that had never listened. And somewhere down the line, all of it would come to a head in a place filled with chandeliers, champagne, and a small silver box waiting to be opened. For 6 months after my grandmother's funeral, I carried a secret that felt heavier than grief itself. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Victoria. I didn't even tell my closest friends. The documents from the attorney stayed locked in a fireproof drawer in my office at Everlight Studios, wrapped carefully in the same envelope I'd carried out of that small room at the church. Sometimes, late at night, after everyone had gone home, I would take them out and read them again, not because I needed reassurance they were real, but because part of me still couldn't believe my grandmother had seen so clearly what no one else had. The Hartwell jewelry collection. Every piece of it was mine. Not shared. Not split. Not to be discussed later. Mine. The collection was legendary in our family. Pearls from the 1920s. Art Deco diamond earrings. A sapphire brooch rumored to have once belonged to a European duchess. My grandmother wore them sparingly, not to impress, but because she loved the stories attached to them. She used to tell me where each piece came from, who had worn it, what moment in history it had survived. To Victoria, those pieces had always been something else entirely. Trophies. Status. Proof. I had heard her talk about them for years, usually as if they already belonged to her. She'd mention them at dinners, at parties, sometimes even on social media, casually dropping their estimated value into conversation as though it were a personality trait. "Grandma's collection is priceless," she'd say. "Well, technically it's worth over 2 million, but you know what I mean." My parents never corrected her. They encouraged it. After the funeral, Victoria called me exactly once. "Have you talked to the lawyer yet?" she asked, not bothering with condolences. "Yes," I said. "And?" There was a sharpness to her voice, a hunger she didn't bother hiding. He said things are still being finalized. That's ridiculous, she snapped. Grandma promised me those pieces years ago. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply said goodbye and ended the call. I could hear my grandmother's voice in my head. The right moment matters. So I waited. I threw myself into work, partly to distract myself and partly because Everlight was entering a new phase. Our bookings were full for the next 18 months. We had expanded the team. A few high-profile weddings had brought quiet industry recognition features, awards, invitations I politely declined. Victoria still had no idea. To her, I was still the sister who took pictures for a living, the one who lived too far away to matter. Then, 3 months after the funeral, I saw the announcement. Victoria was engaged. The photo appeared on her Instagram feed on a Sunday afternoon. A carefully staged shot of her hand resting on a man's arm, a diamond ring positioned just so. The caption was breathless and triumphant. Marcus Thornton. Old Money. Connecticut. The kind of last name my parents had always admired. The comments poured in instantly. Congratulations. Perfect match. Power couple. My phone buzzed a minute later. My mother. Did you see the news? She asked, her voice bright with pride. Yes, I said. It's all happening so fast, she continued. Marcus's family is very prominent. This wedding will be significant. I could hear what she wasn't saying. This mattered. She wants something special, my mother went on. The best venue, the best vendors. Everything has to be perfect. I pictured Victoria, already planning every detail, already curating the image she wanted the world to see. I pictured the jewelry she believed would soon be hers, draped elegantly around her neck, silently confirming everything she thought about herself. I said nothing. The wedding plans escalated quickly. A luxury hotel in Boston, 400 guests, a six-figure budget. My mother talked about it constantly during our brief phone calls, always assuming I was listening, never asking how I felt. Not once did anyone mention an invitation. At first, I told myself it was an oversight. Planning a wedding of that scale was chaotic. Names got missed. Details slipped through. Weeks passed. Nothing arrived. No email. No card. No call. Finally, I asked. I haven't received an invitation yet, I said carefully during one of my mother's calls. Should I RSVP somewhere else? There was a pause. A long one. Myra, she said slowly. Victoria wanted me to talk to you about that. My stomach tightened. She feels the wedding will be very intimate. I almost laughed. Intimate, I repeated. You just said there are 400 guests. Well, my mother said, choosing her words, you know how these things are. She's worried about distractions. She thinks it might be awkward. Awkward. That word had followed me my entire life. So I'm not invited, I said. Another pause. We think it's for the best. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through Victoria's social media. Dress fittings, engagement parties, champagne brunches, comments from people who barely knew her, all celebrating a version of her life that excluded me entirely. And still, I said nothing. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was tired. Tired of being erased quietly and expected to accept it gracefully. I took the documents out of my drawer and laid them on the table. The truth was there, in black and white. The timing was becoming impossible to ignore. A week later, my phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize. This is Carolyn Ashford, the voice said warmly. We haven't spoken in years. I recognized the name immediately. Caroline Ashford was one of the most respected wedding planners on the East Coast. She'd also been one of my grandmother's closest friends. Eleanor spoke about you often, she continued. She was very proud of you. My throat tightened. I'm calling because I have a bride in Boston who is looking for a photography studio. Very selective, very demanding. I smiled faintly. I appreciate the referral. There's something you should know, Caroline said gently. The bride is your sister, Adi. Ender. Adi. I didn't respond. She signed the contract last week, Caroline went on. She has no idea you own the company. She chose Everlight purely based on the work. I stared out the window at the city lights. My sister had hired me. She just didn't know it. After we hung up, I sat very still, letting the weight of everything settle. The inheritance, the wedding, the contract, the exclusion. For the first time, I saw the shape of what was coming. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting to embarrass anyone. But I also wasn't going to protect a lie that wasn't mine to carry. My grandmother had trusted me with the truth for a reason. And slowly, deliberately, the moment she had been waiting for was approaching. I began preparing a gift. Not something extravagant, not something flashy, just a small silver box. And inside it, the truth ready to be opened when the world was finally watching. 3 days before the wedding, I booked a one-way flight from Los Angeles to Boston. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not my parents, not Victoria, not even my assistant, who usually knew every detail of my schedule. I packed lightly, the way you do when you're not sure how long you'll stay, or what version of yourself you'll need to be when you arrive. The silver box sat on my kitchen counter while I folded clothes into my carry-on. It was small enough to fit in my purse, light enough to seem almost insignificant. If you didn't know what was inside, you would never guess it carried the weight of an entire family's unspoken history. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the phone call with my mother, the word awkward echoing in my head. I thought about all the times I had made myself smaller to avoid being inconvenient, all the times I had accepted exclusion as if it were a reasonable boundary rather than a quiet cruelty. Part of me wanted to stay home, to protect myself, to pretend I didn't care anymore. But I did care. Not about the wedding itself, not about the dresses or the flowers or the spectacle. I cared about what it meant to be deliberately erased. I cared about the lie my sister was living in, the one everyone around her was helping to maintain. And I cared about my grandmother's faith in me. I wasn't flying back to Boston to ruin anyone's day. I wasn't going to shout or accuse or confront. I just wanted to give a gift, one gift, and then I wanted to leave. At 6 in the morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, applying lipstick with steady hands. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing dramatic, nothing attention-grabbing, elegant enough to belong, quiet enough to disappear. Just breathe, I whispered to my reflection. At the airport, everything felt oddly calm. Travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases and coffee cups, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding in my chest. I boarded the plane, found my seat by the window, and watched Los Angeles fade into a pale blur beneath the clouds. Somewhere over the country, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I was clear. That clarity stayed with me all the way to Boston. The morning of the wedding was crisp and bright, the kind of autumn day that makes everything look intentional. I arrived at the hotel early. Before most of the guests, the lobby gleamed with marble and glass, already decorated with floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first year's rent. I stood near the entrance for a moment, letting myself take it in. The place where my sister would begin the life she had always envisioned for herself. The place I wasn't meant to be seen. When I approached the reception desk, I already knew what would happen. Still, there was a small, foolish part of me that hoped just a little that maybe things had changed. They hadn't. The receptionist checked the list, checked it again, called over a colleague, whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said gently. "Your name isn't here." I nodded. "Thank you." And quoted. I stepped away before she could offer to call anyone. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want negotiation. I had already decided what I would do next. I called Victoria. She answered, irritated, her voice sharp over the sound of laughter and music. I told her where I was. I told her my name wasn't on the list. "I know," she said flatly. The words landed exactly as I expected them to, and still they hurt. "This wedding is for people who matter," she continued. "Important people, not someone who takes pictures for a living." I closed my eyes. "I just want to give you a gift," I said. Her laugh was short and dismissive. "What could you possibly give me that I don't already have?" That was the moment something inside me settled completely. "I understand," I said. "I'll leave it at the reception table." "Fine," she snapped. "Just don't cause a scene." She hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, surrounded by strangers moving in and out of the lobby, all of them invited, all of them belonging. I could have argued, I could have demanded to be let in. I could have forced my way past the desk and made sure everyone knew exactly what kind of family this was. But that wasn't why I came. I walked toward the gift table. It was already crowded with boxes of every size, wrapped in glossy paper, designer logos everywhere. Tiffany blue, Hermes orange, envelopes thick with checks. My silver box looked almost shy by comparison, easy to miss, easy to underestimate. I placed it near the edge. For a moment, I hesitated. My hand rested on the ribbon as I thought about my grandmother, about the way she used to look at me as if she could see past everything else. I slid the card beneath the bow and stepped back. To Victoria. From your sister, Myra. A woman standing nearby watched me curiously. Are you staying for the ceremony? She asked kindly. I shook my head. No. Some gifts speak louder when the giver isn't there. She blinked, unsure what to say. I turned and walked away. As I crossed the lobby toward the exit, the music swelled behind me. Somewhere inside, my sister was preparing to walk down the aisle, surrounded by people who believed the story she had told them about herself. Outside, the air was cool and clean. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and booked the next flight back to Los Angeles. By the time my taxi pulled away from the hotel, I felt lighter than I had in years. The reception would be starting soon. Dinner, toasts, laughter, and at some point, according to family tradition, gifts would be opened. I knew exactly when she would reach for mine. At the airport, I found a seat in the lounge and ordered a coffee. Through the wide windows, I watched planes lift into the evening sky, one after another, each carrying someone else's story. My phone lay silent on the table. I thought about my grandmother's words, about how carefully she had chosen the moment to trust me with the truth, about how she had known, long before I did, that some things only reveal their power when they are witnessed. Inside that silver box were copies of the legal documents transferring the Hartwell jewelry collection to me, her handwritten letter explaining why, a photograph of us together outside her favorite jewelry shop, and, folded neatly beneath it all, a copy of the Everlight Studios contract, my name printed clearly at the bottom. Proof. Not accusation. Not opinion. Proof. As I sipped my coffee, I checked the time. Any minute now. Any minute, my sister would pick up that box, expecting something small, something harmless, something she could dismiss with a smile. And when she opened it, the life she had built on assumptions would finally collide with the truth. I didn't know exactly what would happen after that. I only knew this. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking myself to make anyone else comfortable. I had chosen to stand quietly, firmly, in my own truth, and that was something no one could take from me. I didn't find out what happened at the wedding until the next morning. I woke up in Los Angeles to sunlight spilling across my bedroom floor, the quiet hum of the city already awake outside my window. For a few seconds, I lay there disoriented, suspended between two worlds, the glittering ballroom I had walked away from and the life I had returned to. My phone was face down on the nightstand. I hadn't checked it since boarding the plane. When I finally picked it up, the screen lit up like it had been waiting for me. Missed calls. Dozens of them. Victoria. My mother. My father. Voicemails stacked on top of one another, messages blurring together in a stream of urgency and accusation. I didn't open them. Not yet. I already knew something had happened. You don't get that many calls from people who spent your entire life pretending you didn't exist unless the ground beneath them has shifted. I got dressed slowly, deliberately, as if moving too fast might pull me back into the chaos I'd just left. I made coffee. I stood at the window and watched the city wake up, the familiar comfort of routine grounding me. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a message from my assistant, Jenna. Myra, are you okay? You need to see this. She sent a link. It was a video. At first, I didn't recognize the angle. The footage was shaky, clearly recorded on someone's phone. Then the camera steadied, and I saw the ballroom, the chandeliers, the long tables. My sister at the head of the room, radiant and smiling in her wedding gown. The caption read, Bride opens gift from sister she didn't invite. And everything falls apart. My heart slowed as I pressed play. The video picked up right as Victoria reached the gift table. I watched her lift box after box, smiling, laughing, performing gratitude the way she'd perfected over the years. Then her hand landed on the small silver box. My box. She laughed when she read the card. I could hear her voice clearly, sharp with mockery. "A gift from my sister," she said loudly, glancing around as if inviting the room to share the joke. Then she opened it. The sound cut out for a moment as the camera shifted, but I could see her expression change. The smile froze. Her eyes scanned the papers. Her hands began to shake. Someone near the camera whispered, "What is that?" The video zoomed in just enough for me to recognize the top page. The legal seal. My name. Victoria's face drained of color. She looked up, searching the room, as if I might suddenly appear. She flipped through the contents faster now, panic replacing disbelief. The letter fell from her hands. A murmur rippled through the guests. Then she screamed. Not a dramatic scream. Not the kind meant for attention. It was raw, broken. The sound of someone realizing the story they've told themselves for years is collapsing in real time. The video ended there. I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, my phone heavy in my hands. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated. Relief. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. My phone buzzed again. And again. I finally opened one of the voicemails. My mother's voice came through, tight and breathless. "Myra, you need to call me immediately. This has gone too far. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I deleted it without responding. Another voicemail. "My father, this is unacceptable. You embarrassed your sister in front of everyone. We need to talk. Now." Delete. Victoria left 6 voicemails in a row. Her voice shifted from rage to desperation to something dangerously close to pleading. I didn't listen to any of them all the way through. I wasn't ready. At the studio later that morning, Jenna was waiting for me with her phone still in her hand, eyes wide. "It's everywhere," she said quietly. "TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. Millions of views already." She turned the screen toward me. The video had been reposted countless times. Strangers dissected every frame, every expression. The comments scrolled endlessly. The quiet ones always surprise you. Grandma knew exactly what she was doing. Imagine building your whole identity on something that was never yours. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't planned for this to go viral. I hadn't filmed anything, posted anything, spoken to anyone. I had simply left a gift and walked away. But the internet doesn't care about intention, it cares about spectacle. By noon, Everlight Studios had received over 300 inquiries. Emails flooded our inbox. Calls came in nonstop. Jenna looked at me, unsure whether to be excited or concerned. "I don't want to talk to anyone today," I said gently. "Cancel my meetings." She nodded immediately. That afternoon, I finally listened to one message all the way through. It wasn't from my parents. It wasn't from Victoria. It was from Marcus. "Hi, Myra. This is Marcus Thornton. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from the photography contract." He paused, then continued, his voice measured but strained. I'm trying to understand what happened last night." I sat at my desk, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. Images of other people's happiest moments captured through my lens. "Victoria told me things about you," he said. "That you were unstable. That you couldn't keep a job. That the family had to distance themselves for your own good." My chest tightened. "I believed her," he admitted quietly. "I never questioned it. I never tried to meet you. And now, I'm realizing that was a mistake." I didn't interrupt. "The wedding ended early," he continued. "Half the guests left. My parents are asking questions I can't answer. Victoria won't explain anything. She just keeps saying you betrayed her." There was a long pause. "I'm not asking you to justify yourself," Marcus said finally. "I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry for believing a story without asking who it left out." A. I stared at the phone for a long moment before typing a response. "Thank you for reaching out, Marcus. I don't have any ill will toward you. I hope you find clarity in whatever comes next. His reply came almost immediately. I don't know if the marriage will survive this. I need time. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. That night, alone in my apartment, the noise of the day finally caught up with me. The calls, the messages, the strangers forming opinions about a life they'd glimpsed through a 30-second clip. I thought about my sister, sitting somewhere in the aftermath of a perfect day gone wrong. I thought about my parents, forced to confront truths they'd avoided for decades. And I thought about myself. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't begged for understanding. I hadn't twisted the truth to make myself look better. I had simply stopped protecting a lie that was never mine. I turned my phone off and placed it face down on the table. Whatever came next, confrontation, reconciliation, or permanent distance, I would face it on my own terms, because the silence that followed wasn't emptiness anymore. It was space. And for the first time in my life, that space belonged to me. 3 days passed before my mother showed up. I didn't know she was coming. There was no warning call, no cautious text asking if we could talk. I was in my office at Everlight Studios, reviewing proofs from a recent shoot, when my receptionist buzzed my desk. Myra, she said carefully, there's a woman here asking to see you. She says she's your mother. For a moment, I didn't respond. I just sat there, staring at the framed photographs on my wall, images of couples laughing, crying, holding on to each other as if nothing else in the world existed. I had spent years capturing other people's families at their most intimate, most honest moments, all while keeping my own at a safe distance. Send her in, I said finally. When Patricia Wells stepped into my office, she looked smaller than I remembered. She was impeccably dressed, as always tailored coat, pearl earrings, hair perfectly styled, but there was a strain in her face that no amount of polish could hide. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking everything in. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Los Angeles, the awards on the shelves, the framed magazine features, the quiet hum of a business that ran smoothly without spectacle. This is yours, she said softly. It wasn't a question. Yes, I replied. She sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap the way she always did when she was trying to maintain control. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. I had lived with worse. I came to talk about what happened, she said at last. About the wedding. I nodded. Okay. Her lips pressed together. Your sister is devastated. I didn't react. She says you humiliated her, my mother continued. That you planned this. That you wanted to ruin her day. I wasn't at the wedding, I said calmly. I wasn't invited. She flinched, just slightly. You know what I mean, she said. The gift, the documents. They were real, I replied. The will is legal. The contract is real. I didn't fabricate anything, but why give it to her like that? Her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. In front of everyone? I leaned back in my chair. I didn't choose the audience. She did. She spent months telling people those things were hers. She chose to build her image on a lie. My mother's eyes filled with tears she didn't immediately wipe away. She lost more than the jewelry, she said quietly. Marcus postponed the honeymoon. He moved back to his parents' house. He says he needs time to think. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not regret, just gravity. The video is everywhere, she went on. Her coworkers have seen it. Her boss asked her to take a leave of absence until things quiet down. Marcus's parents called your father. They wanted to know if there was anything else they should be worried about. She let out a hollow laugh. Your sister couldn't answer them. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, my mother was crying openly now, the careful composure gone. We failed you, she said. I failed you. Those words landed differently than I expected. Not like a victory, like an acknowledgement that was long overdue. I didn't come here for an apology, I said gently. I came here because I won't pretend anymore. I won't shrink myself to make anyone comfortable. She nodded, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. I didn't see it, she whispered. You were so quiet. You never asked for anything. I thought that meant you were fine. I stopped asking, I said, because I learned you wouldn't listen. Adi Enakir. She looked at me then, not past me, not around me, but at me. For the first time, it felt like she was seeing the woman I had become, not the version she'd decided I was years ago. Before she left, she paused at the door. Eleanor tried to warn me, she said softly. She said I was losing you. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. After my mother left, I stayed in my office long after the sun dipped behind the buildings. I watched the city lights flicker on, one by one, and thought about my grandmother. About the way she had planted seeds and trusted me to know when to let them grow. A week later, I went to the bank. The Hartwell collection was stored in a private vault, each piece carefully catalogued and preserved. When the banker laid them out one by one, I felt a quiet reverence settle over me. These weren't trophies. They were stories, lives, moments carried forward. I made my decision that same day. The most historically significant pieces would be loaned to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, displayed in the decorative arts wing with a plaque honoring Eleanor Hartwell's legacy. The rest would remain protected, passed down someday to people who understood that beauty wasn't meant to be hoarded. As I was leaving, the banker handed me a small, sealed envelope. This was also in the box, he said, addressed to you. Inside was a short, handwritten note. My darling Myra, I left Victoria something too. A simple pearl bracelet that belonged to my mother. Not valuable, but meaningful if she ever learns how to see it. Love always. Grandma. I stood there longer than I meant to, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Even in death, my grandmother had hoped for my sister's growth. That hope was something I couldn't take away even if I couldn't carry it for her. 6 months have passed since the wedding. The noise eventually faded, as it always does. The internet moved on. The calls slowed. Life settled into a new rhythm. My mother calls once a week now. Our conversations are awkward, cautious, but real. She asks about my work. She listens when I answer. My father sent a handwritten letter 3 pages long apologizing for years of blindness. I haven't replied yet. I'm still deciding what honesty looks like now. Victoria called me once. She didn't apologize. Not exactly. She said she was trying to understand. She said therapy was hard. She said she didn't know who she was without the image she'd built. I listened. That was all I offered. What I've learned through all of this is simple and painfully earned. The opposite of cruelty isn't kindness, it's clarity, it's boundaries. It's choosing yourself without needing permission. I didn't go to that wedding to destroy my sister. I went because I refused to disappear again. The gift I left behind wasn't revenge. It was truth delivered quietly, firmly, and without apology. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. In the weeks that followed my mother's visit, my life settled into a strange, unfamiliar quiet. Not the old quiet I'd grown up with, the kind that came from being overlooked, but a different one. This silence felt intentional. Chosen. It was the space left behind after everything untrue had finally been spoken out loud. I went back to work. Everlight Studios was busier than it had ever been. But something about it felt different now. The phone still rang. Emails still poured in. Clients still trusted me with their most important days. Yet beneath all of it, there was a steadiness I hadn't felt before. I wasn't working to prove anything anymore. Not to my parents, not to my sister, not even to myself. I already knew who I was. Jenna noticed it before I did. "You seem lighter," she said one afternoon as we reviewed a gallery together. "Not happier exactly, just more solid." I smiled. That's a good way to put it. The viral video faded, like all things online eventually do. A new scandal replaced it, a new outrage. My name stopped trending, the reporters stopped calling. Everlight went back to being known for its work, not its backstory. I was grateful for that. There were still ripples, of course. Clients occasionally recognized me, their curiosity flickering briefly before they decided not to ask. Industry friends sent quiet messages of support. Strangers wrote emails telling me their own stories about being the forgotten child, The quiet one, the one who left and built a life elsewhere. I read every message. Some nights, I sat alone on my balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below, and thought about how strange it was that the world had finally seen me when I had stopped asking it to. My father's letter arrived 2 weeks after my mother left. It was handwritten, the envelope thick, my name written carefully across the front in a way that made my chest tighten. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for 3 days, moving it aside each morning as I made coffee, pretending I wasn't thinking about it. When I finally opened it, I did so slowly. He wrote about blindness, about assumptions, about how easy it had been to praise the child who demanded attention and overlook the one who never asked. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't blame my mother. He didn't even mention Victoria much. I thought providing was enough, he wrote. I thought love was implied. I see now how wrong I was. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it away. I wasn't ready to respond. Not because I was angry, but because I was still learning what honesty meant for me now. I had spent so long shaping myself around other people's expectations that speaking without filtering felt unfamiliar. I didn't want to rush into forgiveness, just to restore a version of peace that had never been real. Victoria didn't reach out again for a while. When she finally did, it wasn't dramatic. No apologies, no accusations, just a message late one evening. "I'm in therapy," she wrote. "It's harder than I thought it would be." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Growth usually is," I typed. "I hope you keep going." She didn't respond. And that was okay. What surprised me most was how little I needed closure. For years, I had imagined confrontation as something explosive, raised voices, tears, explanations demanded and delivered. But what I found instead was quieter and far more powerful. Distance. Boundaries. The ability to choose when and how I engaged. I no longer felt responsible for repairing what I hadn't broken. That realization freed up something inside me I hadn't known was trapped. I started making decisions for myself without running them through anyone else's approval first. I turned down projects that didn't align with my values, even if they paid well. I took a week off work for the first time in years and traveled alone, camera in hand, capturing landscapes instead of expectations. I visited the museum where my grandmother's jewelry was now on display. Standing there, watching strangers pause in front of the cases, reading the plaque with her name on it, I felt something close to peace. She had wanted these pieces preserved, shared, honored, not used as symbols of status. I thought about Victoria, about the pearl bracelet my grandmother had left her. Simple, unremarkable, meaningful only if you understood what it represented. Maybe one day, she would. Maybe not. Either way, it was no longer my burden to carry. One evening, as I was locking up the studio, I caught my reflection in the glass door. For a moment, I barely recognized myself. The woman looking back at me stood differently, straighter, not guarded, but grounded. I thought about the girl who had left Boston with 2 suitcases and no goodbyes. She had been scared. She had been lonely. She had been quiet because she thought that was the only way to survive. I wished I could tell her that silence wasn't weakness, but it wasn't her destiny either. What I know now is this. Being unseen doesn't mean you lack value. It means the people around you weren't looking closely enough. And when you stop chasing their attention, you give yourself the freedom to build something real. I didn't win anything by walking away from that wedding. I reclaimed something. My voice. My truth. My right to exist without explanation. If my family wants to know me now, they'll have to meet me where I am, not where they left me. And if they don't, I'll still be okay. Because I've learned that the most meaningful kind of belonging isn't given. It's claimed. Time didn't rush in to fix anything after that. If anything, it slowed down, as if life itself wanted to make sure I felt every step of what came next. The shockwaves from the wedding kept spreading, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet, irreversible ways. I noticed it first in the silence. My phone no longer buzzed constantly. The frantic calls from my parents stopped. Victoria went quiet again, the way she always did when she didn't know how to control the narrative. For the first time, No one was demanding anything from me, no explanations, no forgiveness, no reassurance that things would go back to how they were. That alone told me something important. They were finally sitting with the consequences. I focused on my work, not as an escape this time, but as an anchor. Everlight Studios continued to grow, but I made changes I'd been postponing for years. I restructured my schedule. I delegated more. I let go of the need to personally oversee everything, a habit I'd built out of fear that if I wasn't indispensable, I'd be discarded. That fear had shaped so much of my life. Letting it go felt like learning how to breathe differently. One afternoon, a familiar Boston number appeared on my phone. I almost didn't answer, but something told me this call would matter. It was my father. "Myra," he said, his voice unfamiliar in its hesitation. "I'm not calling to argue. I need to understand." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. "Understand what?" I asked. "How this happened without us knowing you at all," he said. "How you built an entire life and we were strangers to it." There was no accusation in his voice. No defensiveness, just confusion and something else beneath it. Regret. "You didn't ask," I said gently, and I stopped offering. He was quiet for a long moment. "We thought giving you space was respecting you," he said finally. I let out a small, sad breath. Space isn't respect when it's used to avoid seeing someone. That landed. I could hear it in the way he inhaled sharply, as if the truth had found its mark. He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. "I see that now," he said. "We talked for nearly an hour. Not about the wedding, not about the jewelry, not about the video. We talked about small things. My work, the city, the way my grandmother used to hum while she cleaned. When we hung up, I didn't feel healed, but I felt heard. That was new." A few days later, I received an invitation not to an event, but to a conversation. Marcus emailed me. He was direct, careful with his words in a way that told me he'd been choosing them slowly. He told me the marriage was officially on pause. Not ended, but no longer moving forward either. Therapy sessions had revealed things neither of them had wanted to face. Patterns, performances, the cost of always needing to be admired. "She's struggling," he wrote. "Not because of the money or the embarrassment, but because she doesn't know who she is without the story she's been telling." I stared at the screen for a long time. For the first time, I felt something close to compassion for my sister, not the kind that excuses behavior, but the kind that recognizes pain without volunteering to absorb it. I replied briefly. "I hope she finds what she's looking for," I wrote. I meant it, but I didn't offer to help. That boundary held. The museum exhibition opened quietly, without fanfare. I flew to Boston alone for the private viewing, walking through the gallery with my hands folded loosely in front of me, taking in the soft lighting, the careful descriptions, the way strangers paused to admire what my grandmother had loved. Her name was there, etched into the plaque. Eleanor Hartwell, patron of the arts, believer in preservation. I stood there longer than anyone else, feeling her presence in a way that didn't hurt anymore. She had known how this would unfold, not in detail, perhaps, but in essence. She had trusted me not to weaponize the truth, but to let it stand on its own. That trust changed me. After the exhibition, I sat in a cafe nearby and wrote her a letter I would never send. I told her about the wedding, about the aftermath, about the space I had finally claimed for myself. I told her thank you. When I returned to Los Angeles, I found a small package waiting at my door. Inside was a simple pearl bracelet. No note. No explanation. I recognized it immediately. The one my grandmother had left for Victoria. My hands went cold. I called my sister. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious, stripped of its usual sharpness. "I thought you should have it," she said quietly before I could speak. "I don't deserve it." I closed my eyes. "It wasn't meant for me," I said. "It was meant for you." There was a pause, thick and uncertain. "I don't know how to hold things without turning them into proof," she admitted. "I don't know how you do it." "I didn't always," I said. "I learned." She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for forgiveness. But she didn't argue either. "I'm trying," she said. I believed her just enough to leave the door unlocked. After we hung up, I placed the bracelet back in its box and tucked it into my drawer. Some lessons can't be forced. Some growth can't be rushed. What mattered was that I no longer felt responsible for managing it. Weeks turned into months. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. There were still awkward conversations. Still moments when old habits threatened to resurface. Still days when I wondered if distance would eventually harden into permanent separation. But there was also something new. Choice. I chose when to answer calls. I chose what conversations I was willing to have. I chose not to relive the past just to soothe someone else's discomfort. And in that choosing, I found something I'd never had before. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being resolved, but the kind that comes from knowing you will be okay, regardless of how things turn out. The wedding had been the breaking point, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment everything false fell away, and what remained was finally real. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. By the time Autumn returned to Los Angeles, I had learned how to live with unanswered questions. They didn't haunt me the way they once did. They sat quietly in the background, like unopened letters you acknowledge without feeling pressured to read. I had stopped waiting for my family to become something different overnight. I had stopped imagining perfect apologies, cinematic reconciliations, or dramatic confessions that would somehow rewrite the past. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my life. Everlight Studios entered a new season, one that felt intentional rather than reactive. I hired a managing producer so I could step back from constant oversight. I shortened my work weeks. I said no to projects that didn't align with the way I wanted to live, even when they promised visibility or money. For the first time, success didn't feel like armor, it felt like choice. And choice changes everything. I started therapy myself not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand the parts of me that had learned to disappear so early. I wanted to trace the line between being adaptable and being erased, between being patient and being silent. The sessions were uncomfortable in a way I hadn't expected. Not because they uncovered pain, I knew where that lived, but because they asked me to imagine a future that didn't revolve around managing other people's expectations. What would it look like, my therapist asked once, to want things openly? The question stayed with me for days. I realized how rarely I had allowed myself to want without immediately calculating the cost, wanting time, wanting rest, wanting closeness that didn't require performance, wanting family without conditions. I didn't have answers yet, but I was finally asking the right questions. My parents called occasionally. The conversations were careful, sometimes awkward, but no longer dismissive. My mother asked about my work and actually listened to the answers. My father talked less, but when he did, there was an effort that hadn't existed before, a slowness, as if he were learning a new language. We didn't talk about the wedding anymore. We didn't need to. That chapter had closed itself. Victoria remained distant, but not hostile. There were no more accusations, no attempts to rewrite what had happened. Sometimes she sent a message about a book she was reading or a therapist insight she didn't quite understand yet. I responded when I had the capacity. I didn't when I didn't. That boundary held. One evening, months after everything had unraveled, I received an unexpected email. It was from a woman I didn't know. She explained that she'd been sitting at a table near the head of the room at the wedding the night everything fell apart. She wrote about watching my sister open the gift, about the way the air seemed to leave the room, about how uncomfortable everyone became when the truth surfaced. "I wanted you to know something," she wrote. "I grew up as the invisible child too. Watching you walk away that night, knowing you weren't even there, changed something in me. I quit a job that made me feel small. I set a boundary I'd been avoiding for years. I don't know if you meant to, but you gave me permission. He didn't stayed. Is no stage." I read the email twice. Then I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a long time. I had never wanted to make a statement. I had never planned to inspire anyone. But the truth has a way of doing that when it's finally allowed to stand on its own. A week later, I took a trip alone up the coast, my camera riding in the passenger seat. I stopped at places that felt unimportant to anyone else: quiet overlooks, empty beaches, roadside cafes with no Instagram presence. I took photos without deadlines or clients or expectations. Just light. Just shadow. Just stillness. In one of those quiet moments, standing on a cliff as the sun dipped into the ocean, I thought about the silver box again, about how small it had looked among the extravagant gifts, about how easy it would have been to dismiss. I understood now that the box had never been the point. The point was timing. Truth delivered too early can be ignored. Truth delivered too late becomes bitterness. But truth delivered at the right moment when people are watching, when the story they've told themselves is fully formed, can't be undone. My grandmother had known that. She hadn't given me power. She had trusted me with responsibility. That distinction mattered. When I returned home, I found another letter waiting for me. This one was from my father. It was shorter than the first, more careful, less explanatory. "I'm learning," he wrote. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm paying attention now." I didn't respond right away, but this time, I didn't put the letter away either. I left it on my desk, where I could see it. Some weeks later, my mother asked if I would consider coming to Boston for dinner. Not an event, not a holiday, just dinner. I said maybe, and I meant it. What surprised me most was how little fear that answer carried. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I wasn't preparing an exit strategy. I was simply acknowledging a possibility without surrendering myself to it. That was new. I've learned that healing doesn't look like closure. It looks like flexibility. Like knowing you can step closer or further away without losing yourself either way. I didn't destroy my sister's wedding. I didn't dismantle my family. I exposed a truth that had been quietly shaping all of us for decades. What fell apart wasn't love. It was illusion. And when illusion breaks, there's space, sometimes painful, sometimes necessary for something more honest to exist. I don't know exactly what my family will look like in the future. I don't know if Victoria and I will ever be close, or if my parents will fully understand what they missed. But I know this. I no longer measure my worth by their recognition. I no longer confuse silence with peace. I no longer wait to be chosen. The night my sister opened that silver box, something ended. But something else began. A life where I get to exist fully without shrinking, without explaining, without apologizing for the space I take. And that life, imperfect and unfolding, is finally my own. The truth is, long before the wedding day collapsed, long before the silver box ever touched that gift table, the unraveling had already begun. I just hadn't been there to see it. After everything settled into its new, quieter rhythm, fragments of what had happened in the months leading up to the wedding started reaching me slowly, indirectly, like echoes bouncing back from a place I had already left. Most of them came from Caroline Ashford. She never called to gossip. That wasn't her way. When she reached out, it was always measured, factual, wrapped in the kind of restraint that only comes from someone who has seen too much human behavior to be shocked by it anymore. "You should know what the atmosphere was like before the wedding," she said during one of our conversations. "It didn't start on the day itself. Victoria," she told me, "had been hosting events constantly. Bridal brunches, champagne tastings, private fittings, carefully curated gatherings where she was always at the center, holding court like a queen who needed constant affirmation to remain upright. At one of those brunches, held in a private room at the Four Seasons, the conversation had drifted predictably to family, to legacy, to inheritance. She talked about your grandmother's jewelry as if it were already hers," Caroline said gently. "Not once. Repeatedly. I could picture it easily. Victoria leaning back in her chair, mimosa in hand, smiling the way she did when she believed everyone in the room was impressed. Grandma's pearls will be my something old," she'd apparently announced. "The whole collection is worth over $2 million. It's been in our family forever." Someone had asked, "How wonderful that it's going to you." "Well, obviously," Victoria replied. "I was always her favorite." My mother, sitting nearby, had nodded along. No one corrected her. No one questioned it. And somewhere in the city, I was carrying documents that said otherwise. What struck me most wasn't the arrogance. I'd lived with that my whole life. It was the certainty. The way Victoria spoke, as though the future were already sealed, as though the world existed to confirm what she believed she deserved. She had built an identity around that certainty. That's what made the collapse so complete. The night of the wedding, according to Caroline, the energy in the ballroom had been almost euphoric at first. Everything was flawless. The lighting, the music, the seating, the way the room seemed to glow as if it had been designed specifically for admiration. Victoria thrived in that environment. She was radiant, Caroline said. Not just happy, empowered, like she was finally standing in the life she'd been rehearsing for years. It's steady and oddity. I imagined her there, surrounded by people who reflected her image back to her without distortion. People who believed the story she told them. People who had never questioned where that confidence came from or who it trampled along the way. When it was time to open gifts, it felt like a performance rather than a tradition. Victoria had insisted on it. She wanted the moment, the spectacle, the visible confirmation of how loved and valued she was. She opened the first few gifts with practiced grace: crystal, silver, checks with carefully written notes. Each one earned a smile, a nod, a murmured, "Thank you." Then she reached for the silver box. Several people noticed how small it was. Someone laughed lightly. "That one's modest." Victoria picked it up, read the card, and smiled, not warmly, but indulgently, as if she were humoring a child. "A gift from my sister," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the room. "The one who couldn't make it." The laughter that followed was thin, uneasy. That was the first crack. When she opened the box, Caroline said the room changed instantly. Not gradually, instantly, like a light had been switched off behind Victoria's eyes. She didn't understand what she was looking at first. Legal documents don't announce themselves. They don't shout. They wait to be read. As realization dawned, Victoria's hands began to shake. She kept flipping through the pages, faster and faster, as if moving quickly enough might undo what they said. The letter slipped from her fingers. Someone nearby bent to pick it up and froze halfway through reading it. Whispers began to ripple outward. "What is it? Is that real?" "That name. My name." When Victoria finally screamed, it wasn't for attention. It wasn't anger yet. It was disbelief colliding with exposure. She had been unmasked in front of everyone she had tried to impress. And then came the second blow. The contract. Caroline said it was Marcus who noticed it first. He'd been standing beside her, confused, alarmed, trying to piece together what was happening. When he saw the Everlight Studios letterhead, his confusion turned into something sharper. "You hired her?" he asked quietly. Victoria didn't answer. She couldn't, because the truth was layered now. Not just about the jewelry, but about the lies she'd told him. About me. About who I was. About why I wasn't there. When the photographer confirmed that Everlight belonged to me, the room went completely silent. That kind of silence is rare. It's the sound of an image dying. Caroline said she'd stepped forward then. Not out of loyalty to me, but out of respect for Eleanor. She would have hated watching that truth twisted, Caroline told me. So I spoke. End quote. She confirmed the authenticity of the documents. She repeated my grandmother's words aloud. She said, plainly, that Eleanor had chosen the person who valued memory over display. That was when the guests began to understand. And once understanding starts spreading, it can't be stopped. People remembered things. Comments Victoria had made. Stories she'd told. The way she spoke about her family. The way she dismissed anyone who didn't serve her narrative. By the time the reception ended early, the damage was irreversible. Not because of embarrassment, but because credibility, once cracked, never returns whole. Hearing all of this secondhand didn't give me satisfaction. If anything, it gave me clarity. Victoria hadn't fallen because I pushed her. She fell because she had built her life on something that couldn't bear weight. I had simply stopped holding it up. What stays with me most isn't the scream, or the video, or the whispers. It's the image Caroline described of Marcus standing there, holding that contract, realizing that the woman he married had erased an entire person from her story and expected the world to play along. That kind of realization changes everything. I don't know how their marriage will end. I don't know how Victoria will rebuild herself without the certainty she once wore like armor. But I know this. The collapse wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one absorbing it in silence. I wasn't the afterthought. I wasn't invisible. The truth had finally stepped into the room on its own, and no one, least of all my sister, could look away. After Caroline told me what had really happened inside that ballroom, something shifted in me. Not relief, not vindication, recognition. For years, I had carried the quiet belief that if I just explained myself better, if I spoke more clearly, showed more evidence, worked harder, then maybe one day my family would finally understand me. That belief died somewhere between hearing about my sister's scream and imagining the moment the room fell silent around her. Understanding had never been the problem. Willingness was. Once that became clear, the aftermath of the wedding stopped feeling chaotic and started feeling inevitable. The public fallout came first. I didn't seek it out, but it found me anyway. The video kept circulating, clipped and reposted in fragments that stripped away nuance and replaced it with spectacle. Headlines followed, blogs, reaction videos from people who had never heard my name before and now spoke it as if they knew me. Some painted me as a mastermind, some painted me as a villain. Some turned the entire thing into entertainment. None of them were accurate. I wasn't interested in correcting the record. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It was already standing on its own. Everlight Studios continued to receive inquiries, but I made a deliberate choice not to capitalize on the moment. No interviews, no statements, no carefully crafted narrative to position myself as the quiet hero of a viral story. I had spent too long being defined by other people's interpretations to volunteer for another version of that. Instead, I stayed quiet. That decision confused a lot of people. A PR consultant reached out, unsolicited, offering to manage the conversation. I declined. A producer emailed, asking if I'd consider sharing my story on a podcast. I ignored it. An old acquaintance messaged me saying, "You could really build something from this." I already had built something. What I needed now wasn't expansion. It was integrity. The private consequences, however, were harder to ignore. My parents stopped pretending. That alone marked a turning point. My mother called more often, not to scold or justify, but to ask real questions. Questions that didn't come with predetermined answers. How did you feel growing up? When did you decide to leave? Why didn't you tell us how successful you'd become? I answered some of them. I declined others. "I don't want to relive everything just to make you feel better," I told her once, my voice steady. "I'm willing to talk about the future. I'm not willing to reopen wounds that were ignored when they mattered." She didn't argue. That silence was new too. My father, on the other hand, struggled more visibly. His messages were sparse, carefully worded, as if he were afraid of saying the wrong thing and losing whatever fragile connection remained. When we spoke, he listened more than he talked. When he did speak, his words carried weight they never had before. "I thought love was assumed," he said during one call. "I see now how much damage that assumption caused." I didn't rush to reassure him. Some realizations need space to settle. Victoria disappeared from my life entirely for a while. No messages, no calls, no indirect updates through my parents. I imagined her retreating inward, licking wounds she had never expected to sustain. The world she had built, carefully curated, relentlessly polished, had cracked in a way she couldn't smooth over with charm or ambition, and for the first time, I wasn't there to cushion the fall. That absence felt strange, not empowering, not cruel, just honest. The hardest moment came unexpectedly. It was late one evening, weeks after everything, when I received a text from an unknown number. "I don't know how to exist without being admired." I stared at the message for a long time before realizing who it was from. Victoria. There was no greeting, no accusation, no apology. Just that sentence. I typed and erased half a dozen responses before finally settling on the truth. "Neither did I," I wrote back. "I just learned how to exist anyway." She didn't reply. But she didn't block me either. That felt like something. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice changes in myself that had nothing to do with my family. I slept better. I stopped bracing myself before phone calls. I noticed when I was hungry, when I was tired, when I needed rest instead of productivity. These were small things, but they felt revolutionary after a lifetime of ignoring my own signals. I started trusting my instincts again, not just creatively, but emotionally. When something felt off, I listened. When something felt right, I allowed it without suspicion. One afternoon, while reviewing a gallery from a recent shoot, I realized I was smiling for no reason. Not out of relief, out of presence. That's when it hit me. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. For so long, happiness had felt provisional, like something that could be revoked at any moment if I misstepped or disappointed the wrong person. Now, it felt rooted. Not invincible, but stable. The wedding had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. What broke that night wasn't just my sister's illusion, it was the pattern that had defined all of us. The unspoken agreement that some people shine while others support. That some voices dominate while others adjust. That silence equals consent. I withdrew my consent. Not with a speech. Not with confrontation. But with boundaries. And boundaries, I learned, are not punishments. They are clarifications. They tell people where you end and they begin. They tell you what you are responsible for and what you are not. I wasn't responsible for managing my sister's image. I wasn't responsible for soothing my parents' discomfort. I wasn't responsible for making the truth easier to swallow. I was responsible only for myself. The world didn't end because of that choice. It expanded. Slowly, quietly. The kind of expansion that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything once it takes hold. I still don't know what my relationship with my family will look like in 5 years. I don't know if Victoria will ever apologize, or if she even knows how. I don't know if my parents will fully grasp what they missed. But I do know this. I no longer measure my healing by their progress. I measure it by my own peace. And that peace, hard-earned and imperfect, has finally become something I trust. Not because everything is resolved, but because I am no longer waiting to be seen. I see myself now, and that, it turns out, is enough. By the time winter arrived, I understood something that had taken me most of my life to learn. Healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear ending, or a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It shows up quietly, in the way your body relaxes when the phone rings, in the way you no longer rehearse conversations before having them, in the way silence stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like rest. That was the season I was in. Work slowed slightly, the natural rhythm of the year giving me space to breathe. I spent more time at home, mornings wrapped in sweaters with coffee growing cold beside me as I watched the city wake up. Evenings were quieter now. No constant checking of messages. No background anxiety about what I might have done wrong without realizing it. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me without negotiation. Then, one afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was hesitant, careful in a way it had never been before. She asked if she could come visit again, not to talk about the wedding, not to fix anything, just to see me, to understand the life I'd built. I surprised myself by saying yes. When she arrived, she didn't bring excuses. She didn't bring rehearsed speeches or defensive explanations. She brought a small bag of pastries from a local bakery she'd researched ahead of time, as if trying awkwardly, earnestly to meet me where I was. We walked through my neighborhood together. I showed her the cafe where I worked on personal projects, the bookstore where I spent hours wandering without purpose, the quiet park where I sometimes sat with my camera just to watch people pass by. She listened. Not politely, not patiently. Really listened. "I didn't know you liked things this way," she said softly at one point. "I didn't think you wanted to know," I replied. She didn't argue. Later that evening, sitting at my kitchen table, she said something I never expected to hear. "I thought love meant providing," she said. "I thought if we gave you stability, opportunity, structure, that would be enough. I didn't understand that what you needed was presence." Her voice broke on the last word. I didn't rush to comfort her. Not because I wanted her to hurt, but because I had learned that growth sometimes needs silence more than reassurance. "I needed you to see me," I said. Not the version of me that was easiest to manage. Just me. She nodded slowly. I see you now, she said. I know it doesn't erase anything. I just needed you to know. I believed her. Not completely. Not blindly. But enough to let the moment exist without tearing it apart. My father didn't visit, but he called more often. Short calls. No pressure. No demands. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes about my grandmother. Sometimes about nothing at all. The effort was imperfect, but it was real. Victoria remained distant. I didn't chase her. I didn't block her either. One night, close to midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from her. Do you ever feel like you don't know who you are unless someone's watching? I stared at the words for a long time. I remembered the girl she had been growing up, the way she shined when eyes were on her, the way she wilted when they weren't. I remembered how much of her identity had been built around approval, praise, performance. I used to, I finally replied. Then I learned how to sit with myself. A minute passed. Then another message appeared. I don't know how to do that. I exhaled slowly. Neither did I typed. You don't learn it by winning. You learn it by listening. She didn't respond again that night. But something about that exchange felt different from the ones before. Less defensive, less sharp, less about control. I didn't mistake it for resolution. I recognized it for what it was. The beginning of awareness. And awareness, I'd learned, is where real change starts if it starts at all. Around that time, I began working on a personal photography project. Not for clients, not for exhibitions, just for myself. I photographed empty rooms after celebrations, abandoned tables after events, spaces where something had happened and then moved on. There was beauty in the aftermath. In what remained when the noise was gone. As I edited those images late one night, it struck me how much my life mirrored that theme. The wedding had been the loudest moment, the breaking point, the spectacle. What came after was quieter, but far more meaningful. I wasn't rebuilding. I was refining, letting go of roles I'd outgrown, expectations that were never mine, the belief that being loved required being useful or impressive or agreeable. I thought again about the silver box, about how small it was, about how easily it could have been ignored. And yet, it carried enough truth to alter the trajectory of several lives. That wasn't power. That was alignment. When truth and timing meet, they don't need force. They just need space. One evening, as I locked up the studio, Jenna asked me something unexpected. Do you regret it? She said. The way everything came out? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I regret how long I waited to stop disappearing. She nodded, as if that answer made sense to her. It did to me too. I don't know what my family will look like in the future. I don't know if Victoria will ever fully confront the damage she caused, or if my parents will ever forgive themselves for what they missed. But I know this. I no longer carry the responsibility of making things comfortable for people who were never uncomfortable ignoring me. I've learned that love without curiosity is control. That silence isn't peace when it's forced. That being chosen by others matters far less than choosing yourself. The night my sister opened that gift, a chapter ended in flames. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And honesty, I've discovered, is the quietest kind of freedom. The kind you don't announce. The kind you simply live. By early spring, I realized something quietly profound. Nothing was trying to pull me back anymore. For most of my life, even after I moved away, there had always been an invisible tug expectations I hadn't agreed to, roles I hadn't chosen, a sense that no matter how far I went, I was still orbiting the gravity of my family's approval. Even when I pretended not to care, that pull was there, subtle, persistent. After the wedding, after the truth surfaced and settled where it belonged, that gravity weakened, not because everything was healed, but because I had finally stepped out of its center. The first real test came when my father asked to see me. Not for dinner. Not for a family gathering. Just us. I didn't answer right away. I let the message sit for 2 days, noticing how my body reacted. No spike of anxiety. No urge to rehearse. Just a steady, neutral awareness. When I finally replied, I suggested a quiet cafe near my studio. He arrived early. That alone told me something had changed. He looked older than I remembered, not frail, just stripped of the authority he used to wear so effortlessly. When he stood to greet me, there was hesitation in his movements, as if he wasn't sure what version of me he was allowed to approach. "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded. "Thank you for asking." Deferent tenai, we sat across from each other, hands wrapped around coffee cups neither of us drank. Outside, people passed by, laughing, talking, living entire lives that had nothing to do with ours. "I won't justify anything," he said finally. "I won't explain it away." I waited. I spent years believing that if I stayed neutral, if I didn't interfere, things would work themselves out, he continued. "I told myself you were independent, that you didn't need as much." That was a story I used because it was easier than admitting I was choosing comfort over conflict. That landed. "I let your mother and sister set the tone," he said quietly. And I benefited from staying silent. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't soften the moment. Silence, this time, wasn't surrender. It was space. "I see now that my silence taught you not to speak," he said. "And I don't know how to undo that." "You don't undo it," I replied. "You acknowledge it. And then you act differently." He nodded slowly, as if committing the words to memory. "I don't expect closeness," he said. "I just don't want distance to be the only option anymore." I studied his face, the lines, the restraint, the effort it clearly took to say those words. "I'm open to something different," I said. "But it won't look like before." "I understand," he said. And for the first time, I believed him. Not because he promised anything, but because he didn't ask me to make it easier. After that meeting, something inside me settled. I wasn't negotiating my worth anymore. I was simply stating my terms. That clarity began to shape everything else. At work, I noticed how easily I spoke up when something didn't feel right. With friends, I stopped over-explaining. I canceled plans without guilt. I rested without earning it first. These weren't dramatic changes. They were foundational ones. Victoria, however, remained the great unknown. Weeks passed without contact. Then, months. I stopped checking my phone with any expectation attached to her name. If she reached out, she would. If she didn't, I would still be whole. One evening, as I was closing the studio, my phone buzzed. It was her. Not a message, a call. I stared at the screen for a long moment, noticing how calm I felt. Then I answered. "Hi," she said. Her voice was different. Not sharp, not defensive. Just exposed. "I'm not calling to argue," she said quickly. "And I'm not calling to explain myself. I just—" She stopped, took a breath. "I needed to hear your voice." I leaned against the counter, letting the quiet stretch. "I don't know who I am without being admired," she said. "I don't know how to sit in a room and not perform." I closed my eyes. "That's not something I can teach you," I said gently. "It's something you have to practice." "I know," she replied. I wanted you to know I see it now. Not all of it, but enough to be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. That was new. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she added. "I don't think I've earned that." I appreciated her honesty. "I'm not withholding forgiveness," I said. "I'm just not rushing it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "We didn't talk long. We didn't revisit the wedding. We didn't dissect the past. But when we hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief. Respect. For both of us. That conversation didn't fix our relationship. It didn't magically make us sisters in the way people imagine sisters should be. But it cracked the door open just enough to let honesty breathe. And that was more than I had ever had before. As the months unfolded, my family stopped feeling like a wound I had to guard. They became a set of choices. Sometimes I chose engagement. Sometimes I chose distance. And sometimes I chose nothing at all. Each choice felt deliberate instead of reactive. One night, while sorting through old boxes in my apartment, I found a photo from years ago. My grandmother and me, sitting on a park bench, my camera resting between us. We were both laughing at something outside the frame. I stared at that image for a long time. She had known. Not the details, not the spectacle, but the essence. She had known that one day, I would stop contorting myself to fit into a space that never held me properly. She had known that the truth, once released, would force everyone to confront who they were when no one was watching. Including me. The gift I left at that wedding had done what it needed to do. It told the truth without demanding applause. What came after was up to each of us. By choosing myself, I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply stopped disappearing for their comfort. And in that absence of performance, of pretense, of quiet endurance, something real finally had room to exist. Not perfect, not easy, but honest. And for the first time in my life, that honesty didn't scare me. It grounded me. It told me I was no longer living on the edge of someone else's story. I was standing fully inside my own. By the time summer arrived, the story no longer belonged to the internet. It belonged to us. The noise had faded almost completely. No new clips, no reaction videos, no strangers dissecting moments they'd never lived. The silence that remained felt earned, not forced, not brittle, but solid in the way that comes after something true has finally been said and allowed to settle. What surprised me most was how ordinary life felt again. I went to work. I met friends for dinner. I took long walks in the evening when the heat softened and the city exhaled. I laughed easily. I slept deeply. The version of myself who had spent years bracing for disappointment slowly loosened her grip. That was when the final reckoning arrived, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability I couldn't ignore. It came in the form of an envelope. No return address. My name written carefully on the front, in handwriting I recognized immediately. Victoria's. I didn't open it right away. I set it on my kitchen table and went about my evening as if it weren't there. I cooked dinner. I watered my plants. I watched the sky fade from gold to blue through my windows. Only when the apartment grew quiet did I sit down and pick it up. Inside was a single letter. No embellishments, no perfume, no dramatic flourishes. Just words. She wrote about the months after the wedding, how quickly the world she'd built collapsed once people stopped believing in it. How Marcus had moved out, not angrily, but carefully, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. How her job had changed. How colleagues now spoke to her differently, more cautiously, less impressed. She didn't blame me. That alone made my chest tighten. She wrote about therapy, about sitting in rooms where no one applauded, no one praised, no one rewarded her for being impressive, about how unbearable that silence had been at first. I didn't know how loud my life had been, she wrote. I didn't know how much I needed the noise to feel real. She wrote about our childhood, about moments I didn't remember because they hadn't mattered to me the way they had to her. How she had always felt she had to stay ahead, stay exceptional, stay adored, because she was terrified of what would happen if she stopped. I thought if I shined enough, she wrote, there would be nothing left for anyone to question. That line stayed with me. Then came the hardest part. She wrote about envy. Not of my success, of my stillness, of the way I had built something quietly, without asking permission, without demanding recognition, of the way I had walked away from the wedding, without begging to be let back in. I didn't understand that kind of strength, she wrote. I still don't fully, but I see now that I mistook visibility for worth, and I hurt you because of it. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't demand reconciliation. She ended the letter with a single sentence. I'm learning how to exist without an audience. I folded the paper carefully and held it in my hands for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was something quieter and heavier. Understanding. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that places it in context. For the first time, I could see my sister clearly, not as the villain of my story, not as the favored child who took everything, but as a person shaped by the same system that had diminished me, just in a different direction. That understanding didn't excuse her behavior, but it freed me from carrying it. I didn't respond right away. I let the letter sit with me for days. I reread it once, then again. I listened to what my body told me instead of what I thought I should feel. When I finally wrote back, my response was short. I hear you, I wrote. I'm not ready to pretend everything is fine, but I appreciate the honesty. I sent it and didn't wait by the phone. That was new too. A week later, My parents invited me to dinner again. This time, I accepted without hesitation. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. No speeches, no tears. Just a meal shared with people who were learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to meet me where I stood instead of where they wished I'd stayed. My mother asked questions and didn't interrupt the answers. My father listened more than he spoke. No one tried to rewrite the past. We talked about the present. And that was enough. As the evening ended, my father walked me to the door and said something I hadn't known I needed to hear. "I see you," he said. "Not who I thought you were. Who you are." I nodded. "I know," I said. And for the first time, that felt true. Driving home, I thought about the silver box again. How small it had been. How easy it would have been to dismiss. How it had carried the weight of decades without making a sound. I realized then that the gift hadn't just been for my sister. It had been for all of us. A moment of truth that forced each of us to confront who we were when stripped of performance, approval, and inherited narratives. For my sister, it had been a collapse. For my parents, a reckoning. For me, a release. I no longer felt responsible for maintaining peace at my own expense. I no longer confused endurance with love. I no longer believed that being quiet meant being weak. What came after the wedding wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more honest. A life where relationships were chosen, not owed. Where boundaries weren't punishments, but expressions of self-respect. Where love, when it existed, came without conditions. The truth had burned through everything false that night. What remained wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. Sometimes, the most powerful moments in life don't come from shouting or fighting back. They come from standing still and telling the truth. This story was never really about a wedding, a sister, or a silver box. It was about what happens when someone who has been invisible for a lifetime finally stops shrinking. It was about how quiet endurance can turn into quiet strength, and how truth, when revealed at the right moment, doesn't need anger to make its impact. What makes this story resonate is not the humiliation or the shock, but the emotional shift. The moment the power dynamic changes. The moment the person who was always overlooked realizes they no longer need approval to exist. The wedding didn't fall apart because of revenge. It fell apart because it was built on assumptions, silence, and carefully maintained lies. And that's why so many people see themselves in this story. Because many of us have felt unseen. Many of us have been told, in subtle ways, that we mattered less. And many of us are still learning how to choose ourselves without guilt. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or reflect on your own boundaries, then you're exactly who this channel is for. On Revenge Truth Vault, we share stories about truth, human emotion, and the quiet strength it takes to walk away with dignity. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps these voices be heard. Until next time, remember, you are worthy of being seen.